We're live.
Hey everyone, we are live in fact, and I'm Vishal Krishna, your host for today, and I'm the founder of Pebble. And I've got Archana Muttappa with me, my good friend. How are you, Archana?
Hi Vishal, good evening. Good to be here
Okay,
today.
all I glad to have you here. Listen, I'm going to give a great introduction about you, and I'll tell everyone why we are doing this. I think it's the need of the hour. Okay, a little bit about Archana, ladies and gentlemen. Archana Muttappa is the founder of Two Teaspoon Consulting, a communications firm. Archana manages communications for one of India's social media startups, where she works with teams across 10 languages. Believe me, it's a challenge. I've been there. I know it. We're going to talk about it. She has in the past worked in several PR firms of repute and even headed communications for the Bangalore airport. In the early part of her career, she has worked at the UB Group and has handled the Satyam crisis. If you remember that, we're going to talk about that too. That's going to be very interesting for you founders out there. Archana is a mental health counselor at the Able Mind. That's correct, right? It's the Able Mind, as well as a board member at the Public Affairs Center, a Bengaluru-based think tank. The reason to do this podcast, many of you would ask me this, I know later on. Archana and I have a lot of questions, and we get asked a lot of questions too by early stage startups about PR. Let's unfold the mystery of PR for you. I've been on the journalistic side and I ask the questions, but who shapes the narrative? Let's find out. Archana, who does shape the narrative in our lives? How are you?
I'm very well, thank you, Vishal, and I'm happy to be here. So, narrative, as you know, is shaped by various factors. So, a lot of us tend to think that we shape the narrative. It's both a combination of external factors and our reaction to those external factors. So, it's really a combination of the environment in which we live.
Yeah,
Um,
and it is a combination of these factors. And let's get into the combination of these factors as we go down the interview, right? Let's start off with this. There's been a burgeoning of startups. When we started out, there was no such thing, right? I just want you to talk about how was PR in your early career, right? And you've had a 2.5, I mean, no, but 2 or 3 decade old career. It's a phenomenal career and a beautiful resume if you look at it. What if we look at PR as in the late 90s versus now? How has it changed? That's one thing I want to know. I'm setting this context again in a question of a lot of founders write to you. And I've been advising a lot of founders now. So, how has it changed?
it's changed rather dramatically, Vishal. And the main thing that has changed really, one main thing that has changed is the pace. The other that has changed is that literally everyone today is a journalist. You don't really need to be a journalist with a media publication or media house to actually go out there and put out the news. You and I can be journalists even in the time when we're not doing our day job. So that's something that's changed. The other thing that has changed dramatically is the pace. Earlier, the media would call you and say, "My deadline's at 5 p.m. I have a story to put in. It's appear tomorrow morning," and you'd send in the story and everything is calm. But today, even at 2 a.m., if a journalist reaches out to you and it's an important story, then you pretty much have to manage it, right? So those are the two major things that have changed. While messaging and discussion with media and the ecosystem has also evolved, I think these are the two main things that we watch out for today.
Okay. We've let's get down to the brass tacks of it. Startup founders, like you said, nobody wants to talk to a journal. I have a difficult time. A lot of the founders themselves go write in their own blogs. Then they go write on LinkedIn. They do reels now. A lot of the founders are very savvy with these social media applications, right? But what would we define modern PR as for these people? Why and when do they need PR? I liked it the other day when you were meeting some of the startups I'm associated with. You said, look, at your stage, you don't need PR. But let's flesh that out. So these, ladies and gentlemen, these are companies, the companies that I advise are only 7, 8 months old, right? So, but a lot of them have the money, they've raised funds, right? They come and say, when do I get to PR? But remember, Archana, all these guys are good at reels, Insta reels, that is. They're good at posting on LinkedIn. They have their own Medium blogs. But why should they employ PR at an early stage?
Vishal, let's get down to a very basic understanding of PR. What is PR? And it's at its very, very basic, in its very basic mode. It's essentially a third party endorsement, right? In most cases, the journalist is the third party who endorses your product, right? If I go out there and say, you know what, Archana is the most wonderful person on earth, she's the best thing that happened to communication, you say, yeah, sure, you know about yourself, who else will you say good things about, right? However, if somebody else says that same thing about me, you're more likely to sit up and say, okay, let's look into this. It's worthy of investigation, right? So I think the whole thing really is that to bring in a PR agency or a consultant, really to manage what those messages that the third party must consider about your business. What are the things that you put out there that he or she understands as important to the overall framework of your business, right? How does that play out over the long term? What is the end goal of the organization in terms of what you're looking at, right? For example, if you're at a stage in your startup where literally there hasn't been a product of this nature, it's a first mover in the market, and you don't have enough data to substantiate your idea, right? Is that a time to do PR? Maybe not, right? It depends on the idea and the ecosystem, but to my mind, off the top of my head, maybe not, right? So it's a bit of a nuance, but it's also important to understand that you have some basic thoughts or processes in place before you actually jump into doing PR on a large scale.
Yeah, for me, what changed was, when with the arrival of Facebook, everything changed, right? The way people communicated, social networks changed everything. Like you said, social networks turned each individual within these, they became journalists themselves, and that's influenced the startup world to go ahead and do it. Uh, the strategic part for me is in the messaging, right? A lot of the investors want PR to be strategic. They don't want media coverage sometimes as much as having a startup ready for its first pitch. So PR plays a major role there. So I'm sure you shape a lot of the early communications for these people, right? To shape your messaging is very important. That's what PR does in the end of the day.
Yeah, so PR will help you create the messaging, and also, we must realize that each target audience, each stakeholder would have a different type of messaging. It depends on the culture of the organization. Are you a casual? Is your culture casual that your messaging reflects that, or is it serious, blazer-wearing organization that then your messaging is reflected in that? So what really are we looking at in terms of putting the messaging out there? And that becomes the basis on which you will actually build up from. A lot of the
Yeah,
times, your internal communication stems from that, right?
absolutely.
How do people see your organization, not just from the outside but also from the inside? Because we must remember that our own employees are some of our best brand ambassadors. It doesn't get better than that. If an employee can go out there and say, you know what, that organization is fantastic, they treat me a certain way, they behave a certain way, they're heading in a certain direction. Um, you know, Again, third party endorsement, that's the best to be.
Absolutely. And a lot of this is another thing, right? A lot of the young founders or employees, say the first 10, 20 members, they ask me two, three things. My internal stakeholders, which are my employees, they go and talk about my company on the outside, but the messaging has to be consistent there too, right?
That's right.
How difficult does it become in that case? Because the market, you're talking to investors, and in the market there are these employees going out and talking either in sales or say technology. Uh, it's interesting. I would never look at PR like this in the old days, right? But today everyone's going out there and talking about your company because it's a startup world. How important is the messaging there to make sure that every team member knows exactly what they're talking about when they and I'm sure you can bring this current experience of the language network that you're part of, right? Every team member has to talk the same message, right? How
So it's
important is that?
critical. I think so. It's not just important, it's critical. That every team member or every person, every employee of the organization is on the same page. How do you do that? So a lot of times there's information that you can't share, right? Can you then share as much information as possible in as transparent a manner as possible and as simply as possible so people understand at least the overall objective of the organization with which they are working, right? What does that do really? So for someone like me, if you tell me, you know what, I'm growing this startup and I'm going to have, 20,000 customers in the next 6 months, right? That gives me a sense of how my career is going to go with this organization, for example, right? It gives me a sense of maybe, okay, I have this idea, maybe I can contribute this idea because it will then grow the organization itself. I go out there and I say, I know my organization is heading in this direction and I'm sure about it. As opposed to saying, you know, I think we'll be a few 100,000 in maybe 2 months. I'm not sure, right? That just gives the other person who's listening to you a sense of, okay, you know what, this might be an interesting idea. Let's see how it pans out. So
That's interesting.
that's the difference between the kind of messaging that you want to put out.
It's interesting, right? How did you handle messaging for so many different languages? I'm really curious. I was talking outside, and in fact, I think you mentioned it also. More than 5,000 articles in a quarter. That's phenomenal amount of PR. I don't know how do you sleep at night, and you mentioned the word transparency also. How do you decouple the two things, right? One is managing founders, managing the content, your team, and making sure that you have this entire network that you cover, which transparently goes out and talks to journalists and bring out information on the brand. And I like it because you said transparency is very key for a startup, especially in the early point of time of their career. How did you manage for this company over the last year?
So, Vishal, I'll look at the whole language piece first, right?
Please.
Because I speak, I speak 4 or 5 Indian languages, but I only read one Indian language. One Indian language, which is Hindi,
Yes.
right? So, at the end of the day, I have no control over what Tamil or Punjabi is putting out there, right? Therefore, I have to do two things. One, I have to have 100% trust in my colleague who's working in those languages, the colleagues who are working in those languages. The other is I have to ensure that every piece of information that I have that is relevant to the team is passed on, right? Therefore, they are able to make informed decisions and they're able to bring their ability to bear when they send out content, because there's no way I'm checking that content. Also, I have to say, this is the first time in my career, and I'm a career PR communications person. It's the first time in my career I've actually not had the ability to look at a press release and say, okay, this works, because it's going out in some language that truthfully is alien to me. Right?
How do you verify?
Therefore, I
You
don't
get
verify.
teams, you get a lot of
I
teams.
trust that my team will do it the way they're expected or they're meant to do it, bringing the best of their knowledge to bear. That is all that there
And
is on
making
the
sure
table.
the information is the same from English to other languages too.
Absolutely. There's no way to actually verify that in every case, because even if I apply Google Translate to it, how many times and how many languages am I going to translate? Then, like you said, I'll never sleep at night, right?
Yeah.
So the idea is really to bring the team together and say, we are one cohesive unit. You must understand the outcomes that we're seeking here, and therefore the messages that we're looking.
Okay.
And
Okay.
I'm grateful to say that, I have a fantastic team. They're a bunch of young people. They're a bunch of enthusiastic people, and they go out there and they relentlessly push the envelope every single day, right? It's for me as an elder, it's almost heartening.
You're not there yet. Let me vouch for that. And to be honest, let me come back to the talent, because that's an important thing, right?
Sure.
I'm starting a journalistic organization. I have a difficult time getting talent, and we'll talk about that. Just to sum up the first part, right? You're telling founders that, look, when you have an idea, you don't need PR. But the moment you start raising money and you start getting messages out, it has to be consistent. And that's when you need a PR professional sitting with you and guiding you to. Do they start off on a
No,
consulting
Vishal, I'm
basis?
going to stop you there actually
Go on.
for a moment.
Go on.
And I'm going to
Disagree
say,
with me. It's okay. Fine. Go for it.
I'm going to say that it would vary from idea to idea and startup
Okay.
to startup. It depends on your
Okay.
ecosystem, right? If you already have an established ecosystem, maybe it's time to do PR at the time when you start. If it's a new ecosystem that you are developing, maybe there's room for expert opinion right at the start. So it really varies. It's something that, there's a lens that must be applied to every single startup and every single idea to say, what am I looking at this point?
Okay. Got it. I mean, I'll tell you what, on that note, I want to move into the metrics of it. On that very point you said, right? A lot of people we meet will say no to it. In fact, I've started up. I don't know at what point of time do I need my PR. I don't know. But a lot of people say that, okay, what will this PR get me? Okay, like you said, it's a new, if they're in the new market, this is how they have to focus on their image or of the product or of the personality, right? In the early stages, would it be the personality that we should focus on, or is it the product that you focus on, or a combination of the two? But in your case,
There's no one size fits all.
There's no one size fits all. You're saying
there's no one size fits all, because it depends on the complete environment, the moving parts, how dynamic it is, right? So you really need to examine the entire ecosystem in which you operate before you can actually say, okay, this is the only way to go. And also, PR is not an exact science. There are so many nuances of human intervention that are required in it that it's always, there's always something different. And, if I say something, it's quite possible that somebody else in the business says, no, this is not something that you should do. You should be looking at it some other way. So,
Correct.
yeah.
Got it. Got it. So that's a very fair point. And the startups that you met the other day were really thrilled. The fact that a lot of them wanted to work with you, but they also came back and said that when you said that you don't need PR at this point of time, some of them were stunned. Although they were generating cash and they wanted to work with the senior. It's interesting, right? You're saying market to market, focus on that first, and then PR is strategic in that very sense. I wanted to ask you, you worked in airports in the Bengaluru airport. You worked in Satyam at the time of the crisis. That is like in another level of PR, right?
That's
So
correct.
I hope startups never have to face that situation. But the startup you're at, or perhaps the companies that you've seen or advised, I hope they get to a level where should they start at the foundation where let's say I've done a $1 million raise. Some people just say PR is a tick box. I should get somebody, and therefore it becomes just a tick box and it's not strategic. The frightening thing is they might not realize what comes and hits them there when there's a crisis. That's the question, right? So
Right.
when do they prepare? I want you to answer that question. When do they really have to be prepared? Because seriously, when you start, especially on B2C or even B2B, when customers start coming back and customers will talk, right? They'll go and put it out on social media. How do you handle that crisis? We can see that happening to a fintech founder now, right? The guy has not been able to
Absolutely.
turn the PR around. Every company has gone and smashed him. I would also think what he was very stupid for saying that. I'm not going to put his name forward, but what he did was completely stupid, right? Especially on SoundCloud with his entire altercation with that banker that he had. Right? How does one manage all those? So you're saying he was perhaps not ready with the PR. I'm just saying he should have done it from in the beginning, the moment they raised the first $1 million. Or
So, Vishal, the short answer to your question is you should be ready for a crisis as of yesterday, right?
and how does the
There's
founder
no
know that? How does the founder even know it? No, Archana. I mean, they may think everything is honky dory because they raise money, they're going after market, messaging, they hire some content person, then hire a firm that say a boutique firm, not even a boutique, a small, probably a college grad who has a degree in PR, and perhaps they do the PR for me. If they get lucky, everyone becomes rich, right? Otherwise, it's a real problem out there.
So, Vishal, in any kind of business through the ages, uh, there never has been one sure way to say this is the format of crisis that will hit us. So some crisis, if you're a tech company, you might have an outage. If you're an HR recruiting firm, you may not have enough people, whatever, those kind of things in the framework of the business, those exist. However, unseen crisis, unforeseen crisis, which is where PR comes in. When you build up relationships consistently with the media, with your stakeholders over a period of time, and they actually know you, the media will give you the benefit of the doubt, right? Though I have to put in a caveat here that in today's day and age with social media, it's hard to say who will give you the benefit of the doubt. But typically, a seasoned journalist, somebody who knows his business, will be in a position to put out an article that says, here's how it's played out until this time, and here's how it's now playing out. Is this really true or is this something that's being made up, right? So there are opportunities to work a crisis. Also, with the founder you talked about, while a lot of the noise is around what he didn't do and what he did wrong, there is a fair bit of coverage, and if you bother to look deep enough, there's a fair bit of coverage about the good things that he's done, right? About how he's brought companies to the forefront of the business, how he's developed the business. All of that is also there, but with the loud noise, and as humans, we love a racket, right? We love this whole drama business. What's not to love about it? Your adrenaline's going nuts. You tend to love it. So how then do you as a person look at the other side of the crisis? But I have to say it's much tougher than it used to be. In the day of traditional media, when social media wasn't as rampant, and I'm using that word very specifically, I think it was much easier to manage crisis because you had timelines, you had, people who were interested in both sides of the story. And I have to, when I talk about the Satyam crisis to people, I tell them, I said, I'm grateful that social media wasn't then what it is today. Because, the 2 hours of sleep I got during that crisis, I probably would have not got that as well. So yeah, so I think
how did that toughen you? Quickly to note on that note, right? I mean, you were in your mid-career back then. How tough was it to handle that? I remember
it
you
was
telling me that
extremely
you'd get calls at midnight for that breaking
yeah,
news.
yeah,
See, there's several different kinds of journalists, right? Breaking news guys, the guys who want to say that they have a point of view and they're very critical, which is very important.
right,
That's the subject that I love. There are people who just report, right, on a day-to-day basis on what's happened, press release. And the people who really want, like I said, they may not research anything, but they support the company anyway, regardless, right?
right.
It's funny how even journalists fall different brackets. How did you manage that crisis at that point in time? You want to talk about it a little bit?
Sure, Vishal. In fact, I think that was the part of my career that really, in retrospect only, was most exciting. Because every day there was a new thing, every day there was a new angle. What ended up happening was, we had a good team at that point who very quickly came together and understood that the main stakeholder that was getting beaten up in this whole exercise with nowhere to go really was the employee, right? Because you don't know where the
Agree.
organization is going. The top layer had pretty much moved out. The investors were not playing an active part. Clients were saying, you know what, we're not sure we want to work with you. As somebody who's in the organization, what would my feeling be? You know what? I'm scared. I'm terrified. And the industry is not hiring you either. So really, where is your life go? So what we figured out is while all the messaging was happening externally to the media, we were sending out all these things. One of the things we did very quickly was we started to do a daily newsletter, which talked about all the great things that happened that day, right? Four, five,
Or to
six
just keep
things
the employees together.
to keep employees together, right? We also talked about some of the negative things that happened and put, you know, a clear factual lens on it to say this is what actually happened, right? That basically gave, employees, it gave their morale a boost and said, okay, this organization will probably manage it in some fashion or format. What it also did for us most amazingly was, like most good things, it would get leaked to the media every day. The media started using that daily newsletter as a base for their stories. They would call and say, I saw this article, I want to know more. I saw this story, I want to know more. Right? So we started getting, in the midst of all that mess, we started getting a lot of positive stories. We started getting a lot of feel good stories. And this came from, what we call Cat A media, the media that people
Got it.
followed and looked up to. So I think there were many ways to look at it. And I think it's important to look at a crisis with a human angle, right? To say, who is it hurting the most? Is it that young man who's saving money to send home for rent? Or is that young man who's looking to get her sister married? Or that young girl who's supporting her parents? At the end of the day, those are the people that make up the organization. Is that the lens you're using to look at your organization when there is a crisis? Or are you only looking at the investors and saying, no, I must keep the investors happy and then everything else will fall into place? They're important, no doubt, but there's got to be a holistic view of the situation.
Did you manage the transition into Tech Mahindra?
Yes. So I think it was the 12th or the 13th of May in 2019 that Tech Mahindra bought over.
2009, you mean? 2009.
Sorry, 2009. Sorry, yes, 2009.
We're getting old. Now we're revealing our age, right?
Yes, for sure. I've been around too long.
Okay. Tell me, I mean, nobody asked these questions. I want to ask it because when you work with such a brand and then obviously the crisis happens and you went into an agency in between, right? So how hard was it for you to move on from something as big and then back to an agency? A lot of people
Vishal,
ask.
once I moved out of Satyam, I actually set up my own agency.
Yeah, correct. That's the two
Yes.
teaspoon, right?
So that's
For a
2
couple of
teaspoon
years.
consulting. Yes.
Yeah,
So I
and
managed
so
that
that's
for
what you
about 4
did.
years. Yeah.
Okay.
And in the middle, I took a year and went to spent a year in Singapore, also doing PR.
Okay.
And then
Must have been hard. That must have been your era of trying to figure out what next, right?
pretty much. But I have to say that my stint that when I started out on my own, that was interesting. While I had enough clients and enough of all of that, I found that I was missing a connect with people. because I was working on my own, I didn't have a large team. I was missing out developments in the industry, people moving. And those days you didn't have WhatsApp groups and, social media to keep you up to date with all the things that were going on. So I felt that I needed to go back into a workspace with other people in it, largely to get that energy that comes from.
How tough is it? I want to ask. I mean, this is for all the young founders out there, right? If you are a PR person, how do you stay detached? Expectations from everybody, right? That's clearly there, and you're there for that purpose, right? I've had times. I'll give you examples, right? And in 2009, running a cover on the retail industry of the new retail players in business world, Anand Bazar Patrika. I want to clarify, it's Business World by Anand Bazar Patrika. At that time, I remember a girl called and said, "You had these interactions 6 months ago. Why haven't they come out? And I'm going to lose my job and all that." And I had to counsel many of them at the time, saying that the same process continues even today. It's very dangerous, and in fact, the story came out, and then she thanked me, saying, "Look, I held on to my job by the skin of my teeth, right,
Right.
and barely." And because of that article, she was actually happy. It was a large cover story in Business World at the time about how tech is changing retail at that point of time, and the new age players, right? But how do you stay detached, knowing that in this pressure situation, right, you have demands from clients, and ensuring that you actually get to sleep at night in a profession that's largely driven by, what I'm saying. You can obfuscate, you can also be transparent.
Right.
Go for it.
So Vishal, I think as a PR or communications person, especially as a PR person, when you're a consultant, one of the most difficult things is managing expectations, right? Because I take this story and I give it to a journalist, and it's up to the journalist to write the story, right? It's really, once I've given him the story and created that connection between the client and the journalist, that story is then out of my hands, right? Because I've done the entire groundwork, I've built it up, I've told the story, right? So then the pressure starts. The journalist is not able to sell the story internally for whatever reason. Something may have happened in Russia, and people have said, okay, this is on hold. I no longer have any space in my newspaper, so hold on to this story. Or, now the story is no longer timely because of something else that happened. That story is gone. But my client is going to say, I don't care. You did that thing, you're wasting my time. So what happens to me as that person in between, right? There's a huge amount of pressure on how to make things better. As a result of which, I tend to give in to all kinds of demands. The journalist says, you get me a photograph of some, a satellite picture of the plant, for example, something like that. And I'm putting it out there and saying, as bizarre as it could potentially be. And, the client says, there's no question of that kind of picture. So where then, as a professional, do I draw the line and tell the client, what can't be done? And tell the journalist, what, it's not working, right? Let's talk about another story. Is there a new angle I can take, right? Therefore, thinking on my feet. But as a person, my self-image is damaged by this. And that happens to a lot of us PR people. We're not able to actually reconcile with the fact that we're stuck somewhere in between with control neither here nor there. Right? So it's a tough job. There's no doubt about it. That's a tough job. And as a journalist, the number of press releases you've actually put in the dustbin, right?
Yeah, I used to.
Without even looking at them.
2002, 3, at least when
Yeah,
in Indian
yeah.
Express, you were given these, especially when you're starting out, you're given these, these times, 5 to 7, all the press releases would be given to junior journalists, and you have to read them and see if they made sense to the senior journalists, and the rest would go into the bin.
Right. Yeah, I've seen journalists take the press release from me and actually put it in the bin. Right
Yeah,
in front of us.
I don't
Because
read,
there's no
I don't read
story
press
here,
releases
right?
myself. I don't.
Yeah.
You're absolutely right, and it's an interesting situation, and I think journalists have a different kind of pressure, and only if we stop being curious and asking the right questions, that's when the death of journalism happened. And I understand being honest about this. Let's move to some audience questions. There's so many of them. In fact, there are 5, 6 of them. Let's go for it.
Okay. Sure.
Yeah. This is Jaspreet, right? How can one integrate media relations with other forms of communications in a startup? You want me to repeat
media
the
relations
question?
is an integral part of
Okay.
communication,
Okay.
right? Of
What are
course,
the other
that's it.
forms of communication in a startup? I wouldn't know myself. I don't know. Are there other forms?
So for
I know
sure,
there is
for
I
sure.
know there's a CRM for sure, but in a lot of companies. But how can you integrate communications into
So CRM
all these?
typically doesn't show up under the communications bucket, I would imagine, right? So you have internal comms, you have external comms, right? You have
Mhm.
stakeholder communications, you have CEO communications, you have creation of content,
Mhm.
right? And so there is also something called HR communication. How do the key messages of the organization get translated into things that HR sends us? As simple as a job description, right? Does your organization's job description actually show up as a reflection of your organization's messages, right? So it's literally the entire gamut of information. So if you have a notification, for example, in your, on one of the features of your organization, does that notification, is the way it's written, work for the overall scheme of things with the organization? So you can extend or limit the role of communications in your startup to, either the resources available or the requirements at hand currently.
Okay, great. The next question is very important. I mean, when it comes to startups, right? Startups are often ahead in technology, and
Right,
they're often beating public policy or policy out there, right? Policy takes time to catch up with technology usually,
right.
and so what is the role of communications in that case? How does one react to such policy decisions, which can either work for or against you? Uh, in your case, in the startup that you're consulting at, it's for always, right? And but if
Right.
policy works against, what is the role of communication?
So there is such a thing as advocacy and public, what we call advocacy and public affairs, right? So most startups that are dealing with this kind of legislation and requirements of changes in legislation have a very robust team that manages only that, right? Because dealing with the government is a whole different ballgame. There are a lot of communications people who do both policy as well as communication. I'm not one of those people. I never went down the policy route, but I've seen people who work in policy making very, very effective, arguments and input, giving very effective input to government departments and uh, ministries to actually consider requirements to change.
Got it.
Because a lot of these startups are actually looking at very progressive things. It's not that we're looking at regressive requirements. It's just that the ecosystem needs to be re-looked at to to include them in it.
That's true, and I agree with you. And that's a specialist form of PR itself, right? And I
That's
think
right.
technology startups need such people. I think I mean, what would that be for you? A role where you would bring in a special public policy person, and would that person have to be good at lobbying or writing, or just
It
talking and
depends
meeting
on the
people to about
requirement of
technology?
the organization needed.
Okay,
How fast or how far that needle has to be moved. It
okay.
would really depend on that.
Okay, this is another startup run by a person called Shaurya Kumar, and he says, "How does one go about forming a PR system where I decouple my narrative and the product narrative? Are they two separate things? Will I have to work with my PR manager to have narratives for both, or is it one?"
It could be both or either. I know that's not the answer you were looking for, but it really depends on what you're seeking in as an outcome of the communications that you do, right?
Okay,
Also, if your profile fits and works well for the startup
yeah.
idea that you have, then there's no reason not to use it.
Yeah, especially if you've done, if you've done a great PhD and you've patented stuff and you've sold stuff, I think that individual PR works there too, right? And built and sold a startup previously, that works,
Sure. Yeah.
right? Okay, right. This is interesting. Okay, the next question from Ananya, and I think you met Ananya one of the seminars. How do you deliver the right narrative to the outside world when which makes sure that when you're running a product and your customers are complaining a lot more, how do you ensure that the PR actually works with their customer service team,
I
so that
didn't
it doesn't go?
understand that
So
question.
a lot of people, like you said, social media, right? I'll break it down for you. Social media, people go out to to the platforms and write, right? They go to Instagram and say something about the brand. They go
Right.
and write a blog somewhere, and that can actually get caught by the press sometimes and become a larger. That's how the fintech company's problem happened. They
That's right.
recorded
Yeah,
it, yeah,
absolutely.
right. How do you control? How do you? She's basically saying, how do you manage that in that case? And
So
how does it
sometimes
make
the
sure
best
that it
is
does
to.
not hurt your existing set of customers?
So there are times when these kind of things will actually hurt your customers and your organization, right? A lot of times, though, because we're so attached to the brand and the business, we tend to overreact. We tend to say, "Oh my God, this comment has happened. Let's reply to it. Let's, you know." A lot of times, just keeping quiet, kind of, you know, news cycles are much shorter than they used to be. Kind of, the problem subsides. However, if you must respond, there are ways to do it. You know, reach out to the customer and say, "Let's talk." And I think most times nothing solves the matter as much as talking and understanding the problem and saying, "Here, therefore, can you then go back to social media and say, in the public domain, say we spoke and here's what we figured from it," right? There are
Right.
multiple ways to do it, and I think reaching out is very important.
Okay. Next question from Namrata. She says, "Is there ever an ROI on PR, and should there be an ROI on PR itself?" A lot, because she
And most
thinks that she's
definitely
worked with
should be.
several agencies she's worked with in a startup and not gotten great ROI. In terms of, I mean, what is PR beyond media coverage? Also, is one thing that she's asked. Amrata.
Uh, the media, sorry, go ahead.
ROI and media coverage, two things. ROI being the main
Right.
thing.
So today, as we get more and more data driven, the PR and communications business, you start seeing ROI in terms of messaging, in terms of geographical coverage, in terms of the impact that your articles have actually had on the larger ecosystem, right? Typically, PR professionals have not been data driven. We've said, you know, you've got 25 clips, here, take the clips and go, right? Today, we're saying we've got 25 clips, and this is the impact that the 25 clips have had on the business, right? For example, you know, in this particular place where we did a press release, we got 25% more people to buy this month, right? Which is a product that's available for sale. And, you know, often when you have advertising that runs hand in hand with PR, it's very hard to differentiate which one is bringing in the ROI. But you can rest assured that PR does pull its weight when it's used effectively. And there
Okay, so they
definitely
should
must
ask for
be an
ROI.
ROI.
They should ask for
Yes,
these
for sure.
metrics.
For sure.
Wow. Okay, and and goes down to this one of saying that will about the cost. Okay, people ask me about the cost. I don't know how to answer this question ever. How much does a
Right.
startup have to spend on PR?
Please pay your PR firm lots and lots of money. We're probably the most underpaid people in the business.
What
Um,
about journalists then? What about us? You
so
know,
the
I
journalists
mean,
are a separate story. That we'll have
especially
another
people,
conversation about that.
especially people who don't want to be, cowed down by the ecosystem. It says, oh, we'll give you this, we'll give you that.
Right.
You're right? I mean, there are people like us too who are wandering, who are wanderers, right? And you're
Right.
right. I think now I get it. We have to talk about the talent, right? PR people are paid less. So are the journalists. What should be done about it? What should be done about it? I'll bring in another journalist sometime and talk about it, but in a PR perspective, what do we
So I
do for
think
the
what
talent?
is PR people are typically not good business people, right? We're not numbers driven people, right? Also, when we pitch an idea, we pitch outcomes in terms of coverage rather than outcomes in terms of how it will
I get
support
what
the
you're
business,
saying. I get what you're saying. A
right?
lot of people may disagree with us both now, but you're saying don't be outcome driven in clips of articles, but be driven in terms of numbers, the numbers that can relate to the
Also, be
business.
driven in terms of how you're supporting the business, right? If you were to do this PR program, how would it impact your business, right? And I learned this from one of the PR agencies that I worked with, where the gentleman I worked with is a complete rock star. He's probably the best PR professional in the business because he's not inherently a PR person. He's a businessman who goes out there and he sells the business to the CEO, right? He says, if you do take on this PR campaign, your business will improve in such and such manner. Here are three outcomes I'm looking at for you. Which CEO is going to say no to something like that,
Absolutely.
right?
Absolutely.
So therefore, you then are in a position to command a better price. Today,
And
when
which
you say, I'll
CEO
give
would
you
actually
25
stand up
people,
and respect a PR person? Come on.
for sure, for
They
sure.
will, you, I understand, you're a towering figure. You will say, this is it. This is how it
No,
is. I
that's not
agree.
true.
But no,
That
no,
is
I'm just
not true.
kidding. Okay, I'm just kidding there. But listen, how do they make sure that they walk into the CEO's room or the marketing head's room and say, look, this is what the data tells me and this is what I believe in? How many of us do that?
You answered your own question, Vishal.
I do it.
If you took data to a CEO and said, here's what's not happening and here's what we can make happen, there's no one who's going to refuse you. And at that point, you can command pretty much any price you want.
Great, great. And there's no, yeah, then you say there should be no ego saying, what's this guy or lady telling us, right? That kind of thing, right? It shouldn't be that
You
way.
have to manage the ego as well.
Absolutely. That's a skill that PR people need to have. That's true. I agree with you. And like you're handling my ego, you're absolutely right. You have to manage a journalist's ego. Absolutely. I agree. Let's go to the next question. This is from Aarti. She says, Vishal, you advised several startups, and this is a question for me and you. And she also goes on to say, can Archana advise us on how PR can attract investors? And Vishal, can you tell us about what kind of pitch investors are interested in, especially when it's a SaaS product? Okay, I'll answer that bit. But Archana, over to you. What is some of the advice you can give to them to attract investors with a great pitch? Can PR people help you?
They most certainly can help you, provided you have a good idea. You have an idea that you will share with your PR people in a transparent manner, and then you help craft that message. It most definitely can help. But can it be the only thing? No. In the absence of a good business plan or a good idea, PR can't be the only thing that will bring you investment.
Yeah, that's also true. They should be aware of that, guys. There's no, so, we can shape the narrative, but we can't bring you the money. Just remember that, right? It's your own narrative in the end of the day. The founders should realize it, right? They need to convince them. You're right. You're absolutely right. There's something called image consulting, right? I have to answer that question, Aarti. I will in a bit. But is there an image to manage for some founders? The image fixing, the way they talk, the way they present themselves.
For sure. So again, it depends on what the culture of your organization is. Are you a t-shirt wearing organization or a suit wearing organization, right? Therefore,
Or
how
what
do you
if you're a
appear in
nerdy,
public?
geeky person, for example, or a flamboyant person? So flamboyant, I get. I mean, they'd probably go sell.
Yeah, it just depends on what culture you're looking to project, what as an organization you're looking to project, and it's ideal to kind of match the way you look.
Lovely.
Though a lot of people will disagree with me and say, oh, you're a PR type and therefore you're very keen on how people must look. But I believe it's a complete package. People have to be able to project themselves in a certain way. And at the end of the day, you're not projecting yourself to yourself. You're projecting yourself to a third person who you potentially do not know.
Okay.
Right? So it's best to keep it neutral, even keel, so that people, actually have the opportunity to say, okay, this person is worth listening to. Because, whatever one might say.
That's the crux of it. This person is worth listening to. That's everything.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Aarti, to answer, my part of the question, Archana, I'm going to go for it, just taking 20 seconds. Sure. I think, like she said, I'm going to go with clarity on the technology, clarity on the market opportunity, and finally, clarity of how much you really want and why and how you're going to spend it, right? They want to know how much they can, by spending X with you, how much can they make? So you need to know, you can't just go and say, I want for this idea, for a $5 million valuation, for a 5 million raise, I want a 50 million valuation. Those are the things that you don't go on. You go basically talk about yourself, about the technology, about the team, about the market opportunity, and how you're solving something as the best possible way you can. That's what I believe in is the best pitch, Aarti. More to discover in some of my blogs or videos, so I can send them to you if you can actually email me. Right. The next question is from Chandra Top Chakrabarti. Is it okay? He says, how does one define success when it comes to PR? What is success? I mean, I think it's a literal general question to you. What is success, Archana?
I think if you set out, what you're aiming to achieve and you achieve a certain percentage of it, because no PR campaign is 100%. But, you set out your metrics right at the start and you say, these are the things I'm looking to achieve. And you figure out that it's making a positive impact on your business. And I think it's been success. Of course, you can further break it down into messages and geographies and all the rest of it. But largely, it's this.
Okay. Have you ever met a PR person who loves their job? You can ask me the same question. Have you met a journalist who loves their job, his or her job? Do
Yes,
they?
I have. I have.
Or is
I
it a
know PR
50-50?
people who love the business that they do, and they do a phenomenal job.
That's good.
Yeah.
That's a good answer. That's a good answer. In my case, it's always a 50-50, especially when I meet the vernacular journalists. I feel so sad for them. That's a separate stuff. Again, you probably on your podcast at some point of time. Okay, the next question is from Kasir Khan again. He talks about he wants to bring this thing into the Satyam crisis again. He says if crisis like Satyam happens today in a startup where there is no control over social media and fake news, and he uses the word fake news, I don't know, what strategy would you focus on as in terms of national PR? And is there something where is there a platform of PR where we can go and understand how to handle such a crisis? Is there a platform at all? And the first question being, how would you handle it, such a national crisis? And the second one is there a platform to go and get some kind of news around handling crisis? I hope you're not going to scam somebody, Kasir. If that's the case, it's really dangerous. Don't do it. But go for it, Archana.
So I don't, second question first, I don't believe there's any platform on which you can go and actually pick up this information, but there are courses in crisis communication that various colleges offer to understand, how crisis works and what you must, know
Manage.
to work on crisis management, things like that. The other part of it is, I said earlier, social media has changed the entire landscape. But the one thing that doesn't change is that when you reach out to people on a human level and you tell them your story, most people are happy to actually take that story on board, right? And in the face of a lot of negativity and a lot of comments that one might get on social media, I think the way to do it is to actually go there and say to them, you know what, this is our story, and repeatedly reiterate your story.
Okay, great. Archana, there's so many more questions. We'll try to take all of them and quickly. This is
Okay.
Asina. Okay, Asina says, how does one bring in? This is a tough question, so I want you to listen to it carefully. How does one bring in transparency to a highly convoluted and segmented PR industry, especially when the daily consumers are in the status where they no longer understand what is true or false with the information given to them? Are there any ethics, values in PR today where how do you build a transparent PR organization? This is Asina. That's a tough question. This actually must be really hard. I hope you're not, Asina.
So transparency is not in the PR organization itself. Transparency is in the information that you share between teams, between members of teams, etc. Right, and that's really where the transparency comes in, and that's the important part where everyone on the team is on the same page as far as understanding of what the outcomes required um, are. Right. So I don't know if that answers the question, Vishal. Is there a
It,
part
it,
of
it
it that I
does.
didn't get?
It does. I think basically you answered it. I mean, transparency depends on the organization that you work on. You cannot hold the PR person accountable for the transparency. And perhaps the question is, Arjuna, this is a tough question I'm going to bring out to you. I mean, if you know the organization is not transparent, any organization that you work for, would you be the first person to walk away, or would you go with it because it's your job? Like, just like ask me, would I drop a story if my organization says do a story because we're getting paid? Would I drop a story if I think the organization is wrong? I would drop that story. I would drop it, and therefore, everything that follows I'd face from the organization. But how would you handle it?
So, Vishal, I'd like to say that I would walk away from a job that seems doesn't fit in with my ethical and moral compass. I used to think that I had a very strong ethical and moral compass, but I believe that stems from ego. That whole ethical and moral compass. So I've also gotten to a point in my life where I'm saying that person who wants the story a particular way probably has an understanding of the business that I don't have, and therefore wants it a certain way, right? And I believe that has stood me in better stead than saying, you know what, I don't like this. It's not the way I would have done it. Therefore, you know
Absolutely.
what, take your business and go. It's no longer that's no longer the way I react to things.
Yeah. If any young journalist is watching this is the truth of it. It's your job to verify beyond the narrative, right, Archana? That's something that I would have to put it out here. But you're right. In your case, you have to split between I mean, the morality is part of his problem, his or her problem, the person who owns the
Right.
company, and yours is just the messaging, right?
Right.
Because he
And
believes, he
I
or she
think I'm going
believes.
to add here, Vishal, that it's not okay to inflict your ethics or morality on somebody else. It's
Yeah,
absolutely not okay. And it's not okay to be judgmental of
yeah,
somebody else's framework.
yeah. I agree with you, and that's a topic we'll have because you're also a startup founder. You run something called the Able Mind, correct? Right?
Yes, I'm
We'll
part of the
talk
team at
about
the Able Mind. Yes,
Yeah, we'll talk about mental health separately in a couple of months, ladies and gentlemen. And
sure,
I'm going to ask her
sure.
all these questions. I'm making notes, and this is from one of your colleagues, I guess. And I can read her name, and it's Mitali Ahuja. She's watching it
Hello,
live,
Mitali.
and she says since India is now she says India is talking about local for vocal or whatever campaign in every field. It's all local, right? What do you think? How PR has evolved when it's going local and connecting with people who have never had access to information in the past, but they're doing so with all these new age language apps.
I think what's happened here is suddenly in India, there's this whole focus on non-English languages, which I think is fantastic. It's giving 95% of our population the opportunity to be involved in discussions. And, Vishal, you and I know as Indians, we have an opinion about everything, right? And our opinions are typically in our heads, they're in our mother tongue, they're not in English, right? So what is doing to this whole inclusion of non-English speaking people in the narrative is that it's bringing together more and more people. Normally languages actually divide people because if I can't understand what you're saying, then I'm not interested in your thought process or your opinion. However, if I have an idea of what you're saying, suddenly I'm interested. Or if you're saying it in my language, then suddenly that becomes interesting to me.
Correct. I agree. I second
So
that,
I think
and
it's a tremendous opportunity.
I think that's a powerful proposition as well in the long run, and I think so. I think that's one of the best narratives, and I think I agree with you on this on that, especially when it comes to languages. I think there's so much opportunity there, and that's how the local side of PR is going to be very exciting, right? For you, I think you do
Sure.
what 10 languages today.
Today, yes, there are 10 languages. But what it's also done is it's brought to the fore some fantastic communication professionals who are able to communicate in Indian languages. Earlier we would send them press releases and say, now you translate this and send it out. And they'd say, no, this doesn't work in my market. And I'd say, I don't care, just send it. But today
Got
I'm
it.
saying, I want to know how you can make a difference to that message, right? What
Got
is
it.
your local flavor that will make a difference? And that has been hugely successful for us.
Okay. Amit Kumar Bajpai, just like social media challenged journalism, is it challenging public relations and corporate communications? If yes, how do you manage it in such a way? I don't think it's posing a problem for PR at all, no? Is
Sorry, I
it?
didn't hear the first part of that.
Okay.
Please.
So this is Amit Kumar Bajpai.
Sure.
He says,
Another member of my team.
great. Your team's all here watching. My God, I don't know. Okay, they're saying is social media posing a threat to public relations and corporate communication? If yes, how do you manage in such a case? I don't think so. I don't
No,
think
it's
it's a
not.
threat. You
Absolutely not.
need people to shape narratives all the time. So,
Absolutely.
right? That's the long answer. That's the short
It's
answer.
just a nuance.
Correct. Absolutely. Okay. What, according to you, are three warning signs that startup investors will leave the founders on the sideline? That's like a Mitali question. That's like,
I don't believe I'm equipped to respond to that question.
okay. Three warning signs that startup investors will leave the founders: too much narrative, right? Too much narrative and no revenues, right? Too much narrative and no users, and finally, um, you know, you can judge a person if he or she is kosher with their finances, how much is being siphoned off, and that's for the journalists to verify and bring it out in the news. Mitali, I hope that
So
answers your
that's not
question.
really a PR
That's a
type.
question for me. She's asking, perhaps, you know.
Oh, for you. Oh, I see. Okay.
I think it's for me. Perhaps she just asked you.
Okay.
I could answer that for you. Okay, so Surbhi Singh. I think Surbhi is another PR professional. How do you be different, especially today? There are a lot of agencies. There's so much competition. How do you stand apart from being the best agency?
As an agency?
Yeah, as an agency or
Um,
an individual PR professional who's out on their own, how do they stand out?
so I think it depends on two things. One is the quality of your output, and the other is the quality of the consulting that you offer the client. Right? Anyone can disseminate a press release, but what is it that you bring to the table in terms of the right type of message, the right time for the message? How does that pan out? And then when the client sees success repeatedly, then you're able to say that then you automatically have people coming to you and saying, "Manage my campaign for me."
Got it. Got it, Archana. That's wonderful. This, ladies and gentlemen, this is Archana of Two Teaspoon Consulting. Archana, I can't let you go. Two more questions, okay? And what's your final advice to founders? Founders who want to start off with PR. The two do things. I think the first thing is transparency beyond the narrative. Narrative is good, but transparent ones are important. What else?
I would say, trust your PR team with the information they need to make a success of your brand.
Okay, there's one more question from our audience, and they want this is I think you know her. This is Manju Menon. She says, "How do you handle clients who believe that their CSR campaign is unique and need coverage for the smallest thing that they do?" I think everyone's venting,
That,
like you know.
that is a very tough question to answer.
How do you handle them? How do you handle clients who have expectations again?
So, the standard response is that the media doesn't cover CSR, right? But there are ways to manage that. So, can you put out a blog? Can you put out social media posts? Can you do those kind of things that actually bring awareness about the campaign?
Okay, books that you're reading, and what are you inspired by? Final question before I let you go.
So I'm not reading anything specific at this point. I've been caught up with a lot of things. Poor excuse, I know, but I haven't been reading. I'm most inspired by by what there is in India today, the pace at which things are growing. I have my eye keenly focused on this whole drone business. I think drones, the way the whole ecosystem is panning out, and there's movement every day. That's something that is very exciting for me. I'm reading a lot about that. So there are things that I'm looking at. The mental health space for me, I've gotten back into it after many years, a break of many years, and that for me is very exciting. The opportunity to actually help people and bust all the myths around mental health. So and so communication is something I've done for many years, 25 years now, 26 years now. But the opportunity to do work in mental health for me is a very big one, and that's something that I'm looking forward to as well.
Lovely. And ladies and gentlemen, also check out the Able Mind. That's a startup, right? And that's for the mental health space. Archana is going to be around. We're going to have a mental health panel soon, and I'm going to call her in. And today we did this because a lot of founders that Archana and I talk to come and say, I mean, at least to me, they come and ask me, how should you pitch better? And Archana keeps getting asked, how do you communicate and shape image better? That's the reason we decided that we should do this podcast. And thank you so much, Archana. Pleasure
Thank you,
always,
Vishal.
right?
It was fantastic to be here today.
I'll see you soon. And I'm
For
sure a
sure.
lot of people have so many more questions flowing in. Do you want to do them or do we call it a day? Do you have time?
You want to do 10 minutes? I'm good with that.
Okay, quickly. The question from what's this? Let me just try to simplify it. When should a company hire an agency? You answered it, or a consult. What should a company go with? An agency or a consultant when they're a startup? Quickly.
It really depends on the need. And I'm going to put this caveat in that.
Yeah, what is the need? Again, quickly.
Depends on the need, yeah.
And the need being what?
The need being what are your outcomes? What phase
outcome.
of your development of your organization you're in, who you need to reach out to, all of that. So you really have to sit down and assess what your outcomes are.
Okay. This is Lipika who says 5 tips to founders when they set up a PR team. 5 tips. 5 tips. She wants 5 tips. Go on.
So bring in someone that you can actually, rely upon and trust. Somebody who knows the business, right? Bring in somebody who you can share information with that you would not think twice about.
Founders don't share much information sometimes. Yes.
What is the?
4.
I think
4
I'm
and
going to
5.
stop at 3. I think I'm going to stop at 3. Is that okay?
Yeah, I think if you look back in the entire podcast, she'll have 100 different things from crisis to normal stuff. You have it all there. Check it out. Thank you everybody for watching this. And Archana, as usual, I'm going to call you back. I'm going to meet you somewhere in the city center, not call you to the boondocks outside where I am, right? At some point in
Right.
time here. Thank you for coming down to the university.
Thank you, Vishal. It was wonderful. And thank you, everyone, for
I'll see you in a
participating.
bit. Bye bye.